Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Let's begin with Story 1. The Baker's Burden, Bread, Flour, and Famine in 14th century France. You are standing in a field outside the small village of Montcornet in northern France. It is the year 1314, a time not yet touched by the calamity of the Black Death, but on the cusp of another quieter disaster, one that creeps in with too much rain, too little sun, and the fragile certainty that one season of hunger may stretch into years. The people of this land are not warriors, not lords, not even merchants. They are tillers of soil and bakers of bread, and in this world, bread is everything. This is a story about grain. Not glamorous, not bloody, not loud, but grain, the base of survival for millions. Bread was not merely a food. It was a social contract, a spiritual anchor, a tool of political control, and sometimes a weapon. The field and the farmer. Bread begins in the soil. In 14th century France, the agricultural cycle followed what was known as the three-field system: one field for winter wheat, one for spring crops like barley or legumes, and one left fallow to rest. Wheat, more desirable for its lighter, whiter bread, was delicate. It required dry weather during harvest, careful timing, and immense labor. Rye, darker and heartier, was the fallback, more suited to the unpredictable climate of northern Europe, and more forgiving in famine. The average peasant household did not own the land they worked. They paid rent to a local seigneur, often in grain. A family might farm 2 acres, from which they'd yield just enough to survive the winter if luck, weather, and God smiled upon them. Grinding the grain. Once harvested, grain required milling. By law and custom, peasants were bound to use the banal mill, a lord's mill, and pay for the privilege. It was not just convenience or centralization, it was a form of control. Milling was one of the banalities, or monopolies, granted to the lord over his subjects. The miller took a portion of every sack milled, sometimes up to 1/16. This cut was called the multure, and accusations of thieving millers were common. Millstones had to be maintained, driven either by water wheels or, in some regions, windmills. When rivers froze in winter, grinding halted. In those times you would see queues of peasants at the mill, sacks on backs or carts, waiting for flour. The texture of the flour depended on the quality of the millstones. Coarser grinds meant tooth-breaking bread. Grit-in bread was a frequent complaint in medieval records and a real source of long-term dental damage. Bread as measure of morality. In medieval France, bread was not just food. It was a mirror of justice and sin. The assize of bread, a regulation system common across Europe, fixed the price of bread relative to the price of grain. If a baker overcharged or underweight loaves were found, they could be publicly shamed, fined, or even whipped. The baker had one of the most perilous jobs in the medieval town. Accused of cheating, he might be placed in a pillory with loaves hung around his neck. One 13th century London record describes a baker forced to ride through town with his bad bread nailed to his forehead. Religious overtones amplified the bread's sanctity. In Christianity, bread was the body of Christ. It was not uncommon for people to cross themselves before taking a bite and to treat fallen crumbs with reverence. To waste bread was to flirt with sin. The baker's life. In larger towns, bakers often lived adjacent to their ovens. Baking was regulated, and city bakeries were licensed. Ovens were enormous, made of stone and clay, with deep hearths heated by burning brushwood. Baking was physically grueling and extremely hot work. Bakers rose hours before dawn to begin kneading, often using wooden troughs the size of small bathtubs. Apprenticeship was long, and a good baker could earn respect, but also resentment. In times of scarcity, bakers were accused of hoarding flour or colluding with millers. In some towns, riots began with an attack on a bakery. Bread itself came in many forms. White bread pain blanc for the wealthy, brown bread pain bis for the working class, and black bread pain noir for the desperate. Many peasants ate maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, whatever could stretch a bit further. Some added fava beans or chestnut flour to make up the difference, especially in lean times. From cradle to crust, bread in daily life. Bread was the foundation of every meal. Breakfast might consist of stale bread soaked in warm ale. Lunch, the largest meal of the day, would include bread with broth, cheese, or pottage. Supper might be just more bread with a smear of fat. In some monasteries, bread was so central that their daily allowance was measured not by weight, but by loaves per monk. Children gnawed on crusts as teething toys. Bread was medicine recommended for digestive issues, or to staunch wounds when mashed with herbs. It was also a plate. Thick slices of bread called trenchers were used to serve stews or meats, and eaten afterward if still edible, or fed to dogs or the poor. When there was no bread, hunger began not just in the belly, but in the soul. The psychological impact of famine often started with the absence of bread. The whisper of famine. The years 1315–1317 would later be remembered as the Great Famine, but in 1314, subtle signs were already appearing. Too much rain had soaked the fields. Grain stores from the last harvest were nearly gone. Millers had begun to raise their mutures. Bakers shortened loaves quietly. Peasants, noticing their bread was lighter, grumbled. Markets saw disputes over price. Some families began to eat acorns, soak straw in broth, or boil grass. In nearby regions, rumors of failed crops circulated, and in a world before newspapers, rumors carried a dreadful weight. In the village of Montcornet, the baker Etienne kneaded his dough with growing anxiety. He had 6 mouths to feed at home, and a dwindling sack of flour. The price of wheat had doubled since spring. His loaves sold quickly, but flour deliveries from the mill were late. The miller claimed the river had slowed. Etienne suspected otherwise. He wondered how long he could make honest bread. Unresolved thought. As the clouds thickened over the northern countryside, Etienne lit the fire in his oven for the day's first bake. The dough was lighter than usual. He had added more barley than he dared admit. As the loaves rose in the oven's heat, he thought not of profit but of guilt. Would this bread be enough, and if not, who would be blamed? A nation of bread-eaters in crisis. By the spring of 1315, France had begun to starve. The rain had not stopped. Fields in Flanders, Normandy, and the Ile-de-France were soaked beyond use. Seeds planted in autumn had drowned. The spring sowing rotted before it could grow. Villages like Montcornet, dependent on subsistence harvests and fragile grain markets, were at the mercy of nature. And nature that year showed no mercy. Bread, once a daily certainty, became elusive. And for a medieval peasant, to lack bread was not a mere inconvenience, it was the beginning of collapse. The average adult in 14th century France consumed nearly 2 pounds of bread per day. Take away that staple, and all else fell with it. The people began to blame. They blamed the millers, the bakers, the merchants, and most of all the weather. Etienne's dilemma. In Montcornet, Etienne the baker was running out of options. His supplier at the local mill now demanded silver coin for flour, not grain in trade. Etienne had little coin, most of his customers paid in kind, with eggs, salted meat, or small services. The flour he could afford was coarse, mixed with husks and bits of grit. His bread became smaller, darker, and more bitter. Whispers spread. The baker cheats the scales, they said. He uses sand to stretch the loaves. One morning, a woman refused to pay. "This," she said, holding up the loaf, "is not worth the price." Another man spat his crust onto the street, shouting that it tasted like wood. Etienne could do little. He had already begun baking overnight to avoid the mobs. His wife had sold her wedding brooch for 2 sacks of poor-quality rye. The children chewed crusts in silence. At night, Etienne dreamt of fire, of ovens burning too hot, of loaves turned to ash. In his waking hours, he feared something worse, the anger of the hungry, the spread of scarcity. The famine was not confined to Montcornet. Throughout France, the same scene repeated. In Rouen, records show the municipal granary empty by June. In Paris, the price of a bushel of wheat tripled. In the southern towns, once well fed by Mediterranean trade, even imported grain failed to arrive. Storms had battered the coast, and pirates had seized ships bound for Bordeaux. The famine reached such heights that chroniclers began to record extraordinary tales. Families abandoning children, villagers eating the bark of trees, some reportedly reduced to eating the dead. While these accounts are rare and sometimes exaggerated, they show the emotional devastation of the period. And yet the structures of power held. Lords continued to collect rents. Tithes to the church remained due. Millers still demanded payment for grinding. Bakers were expected to keep baking even when the flour was gone. Monastic ovens and church charity. In times of crisis, the church was both savior and enforcer. Monasteries controlled large tracts of land and grain stores. In theory, they offered relief in famine. In practice, charity was often limited, doled out with judgment. The monastery near Montcornet, the Abbey of Saint Félicité, opened its grain cellar in late summer, under pressure from the local bishop. Villagers queued outside its gates at dawn. Some were handed loaves. Others, particularly women without children or landless men, were turned away. The abbey ovens burned day and night. A record from a nearby priory shows that during the height of the famine, they produced 1,200 loaves daily, most of it distributed under guard. Etienne was denied access to the abbey flour. "You are not the poor," the monk told him. "You are a tradesman, buy it from the mill." But Etienne had nothing left to buy with. He returned home empty-handed. The morality of hunger. Famine tests not just bodies but ethics. Some bakers in larger towns turned to deceit. There are documented cases of sawdust and chalk being added to dough, of loaves baked with spoiled grain, of fraudulent weightings. One baker in Reims was hanged for selling loaves filled with dirt. In Arras, a mob tore apart a bakehouse when it was discovered that the baker had a hidden supply of barley flour he kept for his own family. But Etienne could not bring himself to cheat, not because he was especially virtuous, but because he feared what might come next from heaven or from his neighbors. One night he sat with his wife and measured out what was left, one small sack of flour, enough for 20 loaves. His wife suggested saving some for their children. Etienne said nothing. The oven was already hot. The riot. It began with a rumor. A woman from the next village claimed that Etienne had hidden flour beneath the floorboards. By morning, a group had gathered outside his bakehouse. Some were customers, some were just hungry. They did not knock. They broke the door down and found Etienne still kneading dough. They dragged him into the street. His wife screamed. The loaves were still warm in the oven. One man, a blacksmith named Renault, struck Etienne in the face. Another man shouted, "He has flour in his walls." They found nothing, of course. There was no hoard, no secret supply, just the last of the dough rising under a damp cloth. The villagers took the loaves anyway. By evening, Etienne sat on the steps of the ruined bakehouse, his face bruised, hands shaking. He would bake again, but not tomorrow, not for days. Echoes in royal halls. The French crown was not unaware of the famine. King Louis X, known as Louis the Quarrelsome, issued decrees to cap the price of bread and grain. but enforcement was rare in rural areas. The royal court, removed from the mud and rain, saw little of the hunger firsthand. In some towns, grain ships were seized and redistributed, but in others, royal tax collectors still demanded payment, even as barns lay empty. A chronicler of the time wrote, "The peasants eat leaves, the nobles eat pheasant, both complain of misfortune." In truth, some noble families did reduce their own stores, distributing grain through their stewards, but such acts were the exception. In the north, where Montcornet lay, help did not come. The famine continued. Silent suffering. By the end of 1316, it was estimated that between 10 and 15% of the population of northern France had died not from plague, not from war, but from lack of food. The most vulnerable infants, the elderly, the landless were the first to go. Children were born weak, or not at all. Graves were dug hastily. Village priests read the same funeral rites day after day until their voices cracked. And still life continued. Those who survived planted again. The rains lessened. Slowly the fields returned. Etienne, older now, thinner, reopened his oven. He had begun mixing acorn flour into the dough, as his father had done during the hard years before. The bread was bitter, but it was bread. Unresolved point. As he stood at his oven once more, Etienne looked out at a village changed. Fewer mouths, fewer children playing in the streets, but a lingering silence, a suspicion that the worst had not passed, only paused. Was it the end of the hunger, or merely the beginning of something darker still? What survives after hunger? By the year 1320, the worst of the famine had passed. The rains finally receded. The soil began to warm again in spring. Grain yields slowly returned, though not to their former abundance. There was no dramatic declaration of relief, no church bell signaling the end of suffering, only the steady, silent return of green fields and plowed furrows. Yet not everything returned. Montcornet, like countless villages across northern France, had lost a portion of its people. Most deaths had gone unrecorded. Entire families disappeared, their cottages left empty, gardens overgrown with weeds. Those who survived rarely spoke of it directly. There was no time to dwell. Hunger had changed the rhythm of life, and in its wake came not joy but exhaustion. In the bakery, Etienne still rose before dawn. He still heated the same oven, now patched with river stones after a partial collapse. His hands were thinner, lined with cracks from years of working with poor flour. His loaves, too, were changed darker, denser, no longer symbols of prosperity but of endurance. In truth, the famine had etched itself into every loaf he baked. Memory in the crust. The memory of famine lingered in practical ways. Villagers hoarded where they had once shared. Bread was not wasted, stale loaves were saved, grated into pottage, fed to livestock, or dried and stored for weeks. A bite of mold was tolerated, sometimes even welcomed, if it meant one less day without. Women began baking small loaves laced with medicinal herbs, fennel, sage, even nettles believed to guard against illness and hunger. Recipes were passed down quietly, without formal record, learned by sight and smell. There were breads meant for funerals, breads for feast days, and bread that was never meant to be eaten, only offered to saints, to spirits, or to silence. In Montcornet, a local tradition developed. Once a year, on the feast of St. Honoratus, patron saint of bakers, villagers brought black loaves to the chapel steps. These were not for consumption, but for remembrance. They were baked with coarse rye, ash, and salt, and left to harden in the sun. They were called pain des cendres, ash bread. Ash bread and ash days. Ash bread symbolized more than hardship. It became a ritual of humility. The recipe included flour mixed with cold water, wood ash from the previous year's fires, and wild herbs. The loaves were scored with a single slash, left to bake directly on the hearthstone, and eaten only in symbolic bites, if at all. Children were told stories of the hungry years, when bread disappeared and people boiled nettles. Some older villagers claimed that ghosts wandered the fields on rainy nights, searching for the loaves that were never baked. And so, every spring, villagers offered ash bread. Some claimed it kept famine at bay. Others believed it was a reminder to stay vigilant that grain was never guaranteed. Etienne's daughter, Colette, began baking these loaves herself when her father's hands could no longer knead. She would set aside a portion of flour each year for this purpose, even when supplies were tight. The black loaves sat in baskets beside the altar, untouched but deeply meaningful. The rise of grain laws. The famine of 1315-1317 changed more than local habits. It influenced policy. In the years that followed, regional lords and city councils passed stricter controls on grain markets. Some towns established emergency granaries, magasins de reserve funded by levies on trade. These granaries held wheat for future crises, doled out at fixed prices. Bakers were required to record their flour usage, and markets were more frequently inspected. The assize of bread, once sporadically enforced, was revitalized. New punishments were codified: public humiliation, monetary fines, and in extreme cases, expulsion from the guild. Bakers formed associations to protect their trade and reputation. In Paris, the Brotherhood of Saint Honoratus was given formal recognition. Members were expected to uphold quality standards and ensure fair pricing under the watchful eye of both church and crown. These changes were small, imperfect, and often localized, but they marked a shift and acknowledgement that hunger, if ignored, could fracture the fragile order of medieval society. A question of guilt. Etienne did not live to see the full effects of these changes. He died in 1323, likely of a chest illness worsened by years inhaling flour dust and wood smoke. He was buried in the parish cemetery, in a grave without a headstone, like most of his class. But in Montcornet, his name lingered. Some remembered him as a steady baker, a quiet man who never cheated his customers, even when he had little to give. Others recalled the riot, the bruises, the weeks when his oven went cold. And some, especially the newer generation, remembered only the ash bread and the tale that, once long ago, a baker fed a village with bitter loaves and survived the hungry years. Was Etienne a hero, a victim, a symbol? Perhaps none. Perhaps only a man with flour on his hands and worry in his chest, doing what he could while the world fell apart. Bread as social glue. The centrality of bread in medieval society cannot be overstated. It was the measure of justice, the focus of charity, and the flashpoint of revolt. Hunger did not just erode bodies, it tore at the seams of trust. And bread, when denied or corrupted, could become a symbol of betrayal. But when shared, bread was communion. A meal of crusts and broth could bind neighbors, affirm loyalties, and soothe grief. Even in the worst years, families found ways to bake with acorns, with barley, with mashed peas and old lentils. The act of baking, of feeding others, remained sacred. In monasteries, in castles, in huts with dirt floors, the smell of bread gave hope. A modern reflection. Today, bread is often taken for granted. A supermarket shelf, a plastic bag, a sliced loaf. But in medieval France, it was everything: labor, sacrifice, ritual, and risk. The story of Etienne the baker is not unique. It echoes the lives of thousands of men and women who labored anonymously, not to make history, but simply to survive it. And in their survival, they sustained the world. So next time you break a piece of bread, consider who grew it, who ground it, who baked it when flour was scarce and the rain would not stop. And how many of those loaves were baked not for pleasure, but to hold off despair. Story 2, Salt and Silence, Preserving Food in Monastic Europe. A world behind walls. You are standing before the gate of a Benedictine monastery in the region of Burgundy, sometime around the year 1107. The world beyond the walls is loud. Merchants shouting in the square, oxen plodding through wet fields, children chasing chickens through the mud. But within these stone walls, silence reigns. The monks inside follow a strict rule, the rule of Saint Benedict. They wake before the sun, pray in rhythm with the divine office, labor without complaint, and speak only when necessary. Yet in this stillness, a quiet miracle occurs each day: the preservation of food in a time without refrigeration, without cans, without glass jars. Salt, smoke, vinegar, and patience, these are the tools of their trade. In this cloistered world where meals are sparse and speech is sacred, food is not a luxury, but an expression of order, discipline, and divine routine. Why monasteries preserved so much food? To understand monastic preservation, you must first understand the scale of their responsibility. Medieval monasteries were not just places of prayer, they were engines of survival, supporting communities of monks, lay brothers, servants, tenants, pilgrims, and at times, entire villages. A single Benedictine abbey might house 40 monks, 20 lay brothers, and dozens more hired hands or guests. These people required food year-round, through lean winters, failed harvests, and fasting seasons. Preservation was not just practical, it was essential. And monks, being meticulous record keepers, perfected it. The monastic calendar and seasonal eating. Time inside the monastery flowed not according to the clock, but to the liturgical calendar. There were fast days, over 150 per year, when meat was forbidden. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, Ember Days, vigils before feast days. These observances created a unique dietary rhythm. Fasting required creativity. Without meat, monks turned to preserved fish, legumes, hard cheeses, and sour bread. On feast days, they celebrated with rich but carefully portioned meals, also drawing from preserved stores. The monastery had to prepare for these cycles far in advance. Summer's bounty was stored for winter's need. The cellarer, the monk responsible for provisions, kept inventories down to the last barrel of pickled herring or wheel of aged cheese. One cellarer, in a 12th century English priory, recorded 32 salt fish, 7 cured hams, 1 barrel of onions, 6 wheels of cheese to last until Easter. It was not abundance, but tight calculation. Salt, the monk's most precious commodity. Salt was the foundation of medieval preservation. It drew moisture from food, preventing spoilage by inhibiting bacterial growth. But salt was expensive and often controlled by secular authorities. Monasteries near salt-producing regions, like those in Languedoc or near the German saltworks of Lüneburg, had an advantage. Others traded or received salt as part of feudal dues. In the monastery kitchens, barrels of coarse rock salt stood beside casks of dried fish and baskets of root vegetables. Meat, when allowed, was heavily salted, then hung to dry or packed in brine. Fish, particularly herring, was salted and stored in barrels. Cheese, too, was rubbed in salt, turned regularly to age properly. Salt was used to pickle vegetables. Cabbage, turnips, and even small green apples were preserved this way, sometimes in a mixture of brine and sour ale. Salt was so vital that its theft from a monastery was considered not just a crime but sacrilege. Smoke and silence, the monastic smokehouse. In addition to salt, monasteries relied on smoke. The monastery smokehouse, typically a low stone building with a central hearth and hanging rafters, was one of the few places where silence was not strictly enforced. Here, lay brothers managed long, smoky sessions of curing. Bacon, sausages, and occasionally fish were hung and smoked for days. The smell would cling to their robes, and the soot on the walls grew so thick over the years that in some abbeys it was scraped and used as a pigment for writing. Smoked meat lasted longer than fresh, and though monks rarely ate meat themselves outside feast days or the infirmary, they preserved it for guests, laborers, or as part of rents due from tenants. In one Cistercian charter, a tenant was required to deliver 1 smoked ham, 4 salted fish, and 12 preserved eggs on the feast of St. Michael. Preservation was thus also a currency part of the web of medieval economy. Vinegar, honey, and the alchemy of the cellarer. Salt and smoke were primary but not alone. Monks also used vinegar, often their own, to pickle vegetables and eggs. Leftover wine turned to vinegar was not discarded but treasured. It preserved leeks, onions, mustard seeds, and even garlic cloves. Honey was used more sparingly, not just for sweetening but for preserving fruits and medicinal herbs. Quince and pears might be boiled in honey and stored in earthen pots. Honey also sealed wounds, blessed candles, and flavored the rare sweet bread baked for high feast days. The cellarer managed these stores with obsessive care. He logged entries by wax tablet and later in parchment ledgers. If one barrel spoiled, the loss might ripple through the entire season's planning. And in some monasteries, the cellarer had to give weekly reports before the abbot detailing every preserved item, every dried plum, every salted eel. This was not indulgence. It was administration in service of faith. Meals in silence. In the refectory, monks ate in silence, listening as a single monk read aloud from scripture or the life of a saint. Meals were simple but structured. Bread, cheese, and preserved vegetables were the usual fare. On fast days, a small piece of salted fish or pickled onion might be the only flavor. Sometimes, monks would eat broth made from dried peas and leeks, poured over hard bread softened just enough to chew. Eating was considered part of spiritual discipline. Monks were encouraged to avoid taking pleasure in food, though not to despise it either. Gluttony was a sin, but so was waste. Preserved foods allowed monasteries to maintain this delicate balance between nourishment and restraint. Pilgrims, paupers, and the poor. Monasteries did not preserve food solely for themselves. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Travelers, especially pilgrims, were offered meals and lodging. The guestmaster, another monastic role, drew from preserved stores to feed dozens of visitors at a time. For the poor, monasteries distributed food weekly or during feast days. These gifts were often preserved goods: a piece of salted herring, a hard roll, a pickled onion. During times of famine, these distributions increased. In a particularly harsh winter in 1133, one French monastery gave away its entire store of smoked meat and dried peas. Chroniclers noted the act with awe, and some claimed that the monastery's stores were miraculously refilled in spring. Whether or not that was true, the message was clear. Food preserved in silence could still speak loudly through charity. An unspoken warning. As the monks of Burgundy worked their cellars and salt stores in the quiet year of 1107, they could not have known that just 2 generations later, waves of change, war, reform, even famine would test their way of life. Would their methods endure? Would their preserved foods, stored in clay jars and sealed barrels, be enough to weather the tempests of history? The walls of the abbey stood strong, but how long could salt and silence hold against the outside world? The architecture of preservation. Beneath the chant-filled chapels and stone cloisters of a Benedictine monastery, one might find a vast, shadowed undercroft, a cold room smelling faintly of damp earth, beeswax, and old cheese. These monastic cellars were architectural testaments to long-term thinking. Arched for strength, deeply set for insulation, and shielded from light and heat, they were essential in preserving not just food, but the rhythm of monastic life. Some monasteries had multiple levels of storage: a cool stone chamber for cured meats and cheeses, a dry loft above the kitchen for hanging herbs, and separate larders for grain, beans, and pulses. Root cellars, dug deeper still, stored turnips, carrots, onions, and parsnips layered with straw or sand to preserve them through the winter. And always, there was the buttery, not a place for butter, but a storeroom for wine and ale, measured and distributed by a monk known as the butler or batarius. Without refrigeration or glass bottles, casks of ale were brewed and tapped in sequence, and only carefully fermented wine was trusted to last the season. Preservation was not a single act, but an ongoing orchestration of temperature, humidity, rotation, and faith. The role of the lay brother. Much of this work, the digging of cellars, the salting of meats, the brewing of ale, fell not to the chanting monks of the choir, but to their less glorified counterparts, the conversi, or lay brothers. Lay brothers were often illiterate men who joined the monastery for spiritual reasons but were not ordained. They worked in the fields, managed livestock, tended orchards, and preserved food. Their hours were as long as any monk, and their labor, though silent, sustained the entire community. In one English Cistercian monastery, records note that the lay brothers processed over 300 sides of bacon in a single November. They salted, smoked, turned, and hung them in orderly rows, noting the date of each cut. They also dried apples on wicker racks, strung beans across rafters, and brewed ale in great copper cauldrons, always careful to skim off the foam and stir clockwise, as tradition dictated. Despite their status, they were essential. Without them, the choir monks could not keep their schedule of prayer nor eat their meager but critical meals. The preservation of fish. Monks, especially those of the Benedictine and Cistercian orders, often followed dietary restrictions that limited or prohibited meat. Fish became a crucial substitute, especially on fasting days. But fresh fish spoiled quickly. Thus, monasteries developed advanced networks for acquiring, preserving, and storing fish. Herring was the fish of choice, abundant, oily, and especially receptive to salting. It was purchased in bulk from northern coasts, England, the Low Countries, the North Sea. Barrels of salted herring arrived by cart or ship and were stored in cool cellars. Inland monasteries also developed fish ponds vivaria where they raised carp, eel, and pike. These ponds were carefully maintained, sometimes layered in cascading levels so water could be drained and filtered. Eels, slippery and resilient, could be smoked, salted, or kept alive in barrels of wet moss. A record from Cluny Abbey in the 12th century shows that monks consumed over 16,000 fish annually, nearly all of it preserved. In many ways, their religious abstinence drove them to greater culinary ingenuity. Cheese, curd, and caution. Cheese was both sustenance and solution. Monasteries often owned herds of cows, goats, or sheep. Milk, being highly perishable, was quickly turned into cheese. The resulting wheels were dried, rubbed with salt or herbs, and aged in stone rooms for months or even years. Monks refined cheesemaking into a science. Hard cheeses were ideal for preservation, dense, slow to mold, and easy to transport. Some abbeys, like those in the Alps, began producing distinctive cheeses that would evolve into what we now know as Gruyere or Comté. The Trappists, centuries later, would carry this legacy into names like Port Salut and Chimay. Soft cheeses, though riskier, were eaten fresh or used in cooking. In some monastic recipes, cheese was mixed with herbs and pounded into a paste to flavor pottage or spread over barley cakes. And curiously, cheese was often the only animal protein allowed on certain fasting days, a theological loophole that monks rarely questioned too hard. Food as a measure of devotion. Despite their strict schedules and measured diets, monks could fall prey to the sin of gluttony. The rule of Saint Benedict warned, "We think it sufficient for the daily dinner to comprise 2 cooked dishes. If fruit or fresh vegetables are available, let a third dish be added." The portioning of meals was heavily regulated. A typical monk's diet might include 1–2 pounds of bread daily, supplemented by vegetables, beans, and on occasion fish or cheese. Wine was permitted, though limited to about 1/4 liter per day. Preserved foods ensured these portions could be maintained even when fresh supplies ran low. But the cellarer's notes occasionally reveal tensions. Brothers complained of sour ale, casks spoiled. Onion stores rotted, root cellar flooded. Barley meal full of beetles replaced with rye flour. Such entries remind us that even in the orderly world of the monastery, decay was always waiting. The monks preserved not just to feed themselves, but to shield their sacred rhythm from chaos. Guests, diplomacy, and the hidden abundance. While monks ate simply, guests of high status received better fare. When a bishop or nobleman arrived, the kitchen produced preserved delicacies reserved for such occasions. Smoked trout, hard sausages, dried pears stewed in wine, pickled walnuts, even preserved rose petals in honey. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was diplomacy. To honor a guest with aged cheese or long-preserved fish was to demonstrate foresight, abundance, and piety. And so the monks preserved not just for survival, but for image. In some cases, abbots sent barrels of preserved food as gifts to neighboring lords, bishops, or abbesses. One record from a German monastery lists a gift sent in Advent. 1 cured ham, 3 jars of salted beans, a wheel of aged cheese, and a scroll of blessing. Preservation, in this sense, became a form of monastic soft power. Preservation during famine. When famine struck the countryside, as it did in 1095, 1126, and later during the Great Famine of 1315-17, monastic cellars became lifelines. The cellarer would ration out stores with brutal care. One day less of pickled cabbage might mean one more week of survival. In such times, dried beans and smoked meats were hoarded, and lesser-used items brought forth. Dried nettles, mushroom powder, or vinegar-thickened soups. Monks sometimes wrote of famine with the stoicism of Scripture. We ate once per day. No ale, only water. The beans were small and full of worms, yet we gave thanks. The preservation methods that monks had practiced for centuries allowed them to weather these years more successfully than many secular communities. But even they were not immune. In 1132, a monastery in northern France recorded, "The cellars are empty. We have salted what we could. The Lord will provide, but the snow has not stopped." A quiet collapse. By the close of the 12th century, pressures began to mount. The growing influence of cities, the rise of trade guilds, and the emergence of commercial food markets began to erode the monastery's dominance in food preparation. Urban bakers, cheesemakers, and fishmongers began to specialize and preserve more efficiently. Meanwhile, internal monastic reforms such as the stricter Cistercian movement further limited the consumption of rich or preserved foods. For some, even cheese and eggs became suspect luxuries. And beyond the walls, heretics, reformers, and kings began to question the privileges of the cloister. Would the preservation methods perfected in silence find a place in the changing world? A world outside the walls. By the 13th century, Europe was changing. Towns were growing, trade routes expanding, and food markets emerging in places once untouched by regular commerce. The monastic world, self-contained, self-sustaining, and methodically quiet, was no longer the sole custodian of preservation. And yet its influence persisted. The monastery had not only fed its own, it had quietly set standards. It had preserved more than food, it had preserved order, stability, and a model of life where resourcefulness was sanctified. Now, as merchants traded pickled eggs in market stalls and barrels of herring flowed down the Rhine, many of those practices could trace their lineage back to cloisters, where monks once stirred vinegar pots in silence and salted their fish by candlelight, preserving knowledge as well as food. In addition to the physical act of preservation, monasteries preserved knowledge, and this proved even more enduring. In their scriptoria, monks recorded recipes, storage methods, garden practices, and medicinal uses for preserved herbs and food. These weren't recipe books in the modern sense, but practical lists, marginal notes, and careful annotations in herbals, treatises, and account ledgers. One such record from a 12th century German Benedictine monastery includes a vinegar pickle for onions alongside instructions for drying elderberries. Another manuscript details how to preserve rose hips for winter pottage and how smoked eel could be softened in wine for infirm monks. Much of what we know today about medieval food preservation, the layering of root vegetables, the correct salinity for meat brining, the length of time needed to air-dry cheese comes from these documents. The monks not only practiced preservation, they codified it. The decline of isolation. Despite their foresight, monasteries could not remain isolated forever. By the late 13th century, many monastic communities faced crises. Agricultural overexpansion led to soil exhaustion. The growing economic power of towns and the independence of guilds challenged monastic influence over food production. Some monasteries became entangled in local politics or mired in scandal. Others struggled to maintain vocations, with fewer lay brothers joining and increased reliance on hired laborers. The old system of self-sufficiency frayed. Even the role of food began to shift. Monks once praised for feeding the poor were now criticized, often unfairly, for hoarding or living in quiet luxury. Reformers argued that the simplicity of early monastic life had been replaced by comfort. Yet even as their temporal power waned, the techniques they developed endured. In towns, ex-monks opened cheese shops. Former lay brothers worked as brewers. Recipes copied in scriptoriums were recopied in merchant households. The monastery had seeded something deeper than walls could contain. The legacy of the cellarer. Among all the monastic roles, the cellarer stands out as the quiet architect of survival. Responsible for everything from salted fish to the ale tap, he embodied the link between order and nourishment. He was not a cook, but a steward, ensuring that hunger never disrupted the sacred rhythm of the monastic day. And in that role, the cellarer represents a forgotten type of historical figure. Not a warrior, king, or explorer, but a humble administrator of balance. He measured what could last. He planned for seasons, storms, and scarcity. His success was not seen in abundance, but in quiet continuity. In a world without refrigeration, electricity, or convenience, that was a profound achievement. Rituals that endure. Some monasteries still bake and preserve using medieval methods. In regions of France, Belgium, and Bavaria, Trappist monks continue to age cheese, ferment beer, and dry fruit with techniques passed down through centuries. Modern cheesemakers still salt their wheels the way Cistercian monks did. Brine curing, air drying, vinegar pickling, these are not rustic novelties. They are preserved technologies, still practical, still powerful. And in monasteries that welcome guests today, the same sense of ordered humility can be tasted in a slice of dense bread, in a curl of hard cheese, in the soft tang of pickled vegetables grown from the garden outside. Every bite carries not just flavor, but memory. Lessons in stillness. The modern world, filled with abundance and noise, rarely remembers the monastic rhythm. Yet, there is something instructive in it, the idea that preservation is not just about extending the shelf life of food, but about creating stability in a world defined by uncertainty. Salt, smoke, silence, tools of resilience. From the humble turnip, carefully stored in a root cellar, to the salted herring, packed in a dark barrel, each was a prayer against chaos. Monks preserved food not because they feared hunger, but because they respected time. They preserved so the chant could continue, so the day could unfold, so the spirit could rest. Final reflection. What began in shadowed cellars and smoked stone rooms still feeds us today in practice, in tradition, in quiet reverence for simplicity. When you open a jar of pickles, unwrap a wedge of aged cheese, or taste something lovingly fermented, remember the cellarers, the lay brothers, the silent workers in wool robes who measured each season and salted each fish, not for profit but for peace. Their silence is long past, but their preservation continues. Story 3, Dining in the Dark Ages, a day at a Saxon hearth. The hearth as center of the world. It is a damp morning in the Wessex countryside, sometime around the year 715. The mist clings to the grass. A dog barks in the distance. Birds stir in bare trees, but you are inside a small, smoky house built of wattle and daub. The thatched roof above your head leaks slightly at the corners, but at the center of the room glows a low, steady fire. This hearth is not merely for warmth, it is the entire heart of the household. Light, heat, protection, and above all, food. In the early medieval world, often known as the Dark Ages, the hearth was everything. There was no kitchen as we know it, no pantry, no table. The meals of the Saxons, Britons, and other early medieval peoples were simple, slow, and shaped entirely by the fire that never quite went out. We begin not in the grand halls of kings, but in the daily life of a farming family, where meals were built from grains, gathered herbs, smoked pork, and patience. A morning meal without a name. The early Saxons did not follow our modern mealtime structure. There was no breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Meals were taken when work allowed, and often only twice per day, one in the late morning after early labor, and one in the evening after chores were done. The morning began with the rekindling of the hearth. Ashes from the previous night were cleared, and the embers coaxed back into flame. A clay or iron pot, soot darkened and dented from years of use, was hung from a chain or placed on stones above the fire. Into it went the morning pottage. Pottage was not a dish, it was a way of life. A thick, slow-cooked stew of whatever was on hand. Grains like barley or oats, a few lentils if lucky, wild leeks, turnip greens, perhaps some leftover bits of bacon or dried meat. The flavor came not from spice, but from smoke and salt and thyme. The whole family, parents, children, perhaps a grandparent, gathered to eat it with wooden spoons from a shared bowl. Bread, if there was any, was used to scoop. There were no plates. It was filling, warm, and entirely unspectacular. And for many, it was the most reliable meal of the day. Grains, the real daily bread. Bread in early Anglo-Saxon England was often coarse, heavy, and dark. Wheat was rare and reserved for wealthier households or religious institutions. Most people ate bread made from barley, rye, or even maslin, a mix of available grains. It was baked in simple clay ovens or directly on hot stones beside the hearth. But even bread was not always available. More often, grains were boiled into porridge or pottage. A record from later in the period describes workers eating bruit, a kind of savory grain stew thickened with beans or peas. Sometimes ash or sand made its way into the bread, depending on the millstones used. Dental wear was common. Even among the devout, saints' relics include jawbones worn down from years of chewing hard loaves. Grain was ground by hand in small rotary querns, often by women. The labor was slow and punishing. Turning the quernstone for an hour might yield only enough flour for a small loaf. This made every bite hard one. Salt, smoke, and storage. Preservation in this era was critical. There were no larders or pantries, only cool corners, suspended sacks, and the slow wisdom of older generations. Salt was precious and difficult to obtain in inland regions. It was mined or harvested from coastal flats, then traded across difficult roads. Meat, when preserved, was either salted, dried, or smoked in lofts above the hearth where the smoke would curl upward into the thatch. Pork was the meat of choice. Pigs could be raised on scraps and let forage in the woods. In autumn, entire villages gathered for pig slaughter, salting and drying what they could. The preserved cuts might last the winter. For the rest of the year, protein came from fish, fresh, smoked or dried, occasional birds or eggs. Cheese was made from goat or cow milk, eaten fresh or dried into hard, long-lasting lumps. There were no spices, no sugar. Honey sweetened rare feast day dishes. Vinegar made from soured ale was used to pickle onions or preserve turnips. Food was simple, but survival was sophisticated. Foraging and the feminine kitchen. Much of the food in a Saxon household came not from the field or market, but from the woods and hedgerows. Women and children foraged for wild greens, nuts, berries, and herbs. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter included which plants were safe, which healed, and which killed. Nettles were boiled into soup. Sorrel added bite to porridge. Ground elder, goosefoot, and fat hen, all now considered weeds, were once vital greens. Mushrooms were gathered cautiously. Wild apples and crabapples were stored or stewed. Hazelnuts were prized. Dandelion roots were sometimes roasted. Every season dictated the foraging rhythm. And in each season, the hearth responded, bubbling with different stews, different smells, but always the same quiet rhythm of survival. The silent meal. In the Saxon household, meals were not ceremonial. They were necessity. There was little conversation, not from cultural prohibition, but from exhaustion. Work began at dawn and ended with dusk. Meals were often eaten seated on stools or standing near the hearth. The wealthy might have a board set with cups and trenchers, flat bread used as plates. But the common folk had little more than shared bowls, wooden spoons, and clay mugs for ale. Ale, in fact, was drunk by everyone, including children, as it was safer than water. The brew was weak, thick, and often flavored with herbs like horehound, meadowsweet, or yarrow. At the end of the day, a final bowl of pottage was warmed, perhaps with a scrap of cheese or a knob of bacon fat stirred in. Afterward, the hearth was banked to hold embers overnight. The family slept on straw beds while smoke lingered faintly in the rafters. There was no dessert, there was no ceremony. But there was food, and that meant there was still a tomorrow. One day in 100 years. If you could travel back to early medieval England and observe a single day in any farming household, it would likely be indistinguishable from the one before it or the one after. The same chores, the same flavors, the same creaking quern and simmering pot. And yet from this quiet repetition came endurance. The hearth kept burning through wars, invasions, plagues, and dynastic changes. Kings might fall, churches might rise, but the pottage still simmered. In a way, it was the most powerful force in the land, because it kept people alive when nothing else could. Unresolved thought. As the embers glow low in the Saxon hearth and the last bowl is scraped clean, a question hangs in the smoke. What changed first, the food, or the world that required it? Between starvation and celebration. In the quiet rhythm of Saxon life, most meals were humble, but not all days were the same. Though subsistence defined the daily table, the early medieval calendar was punctuated by feast days, fast days, harvests, and holy celebrations. These events created brief but intense shifts in the kitchen if the household was fortunate enough to have something extra to give. Just as survival depended on the pottage pot, community identity was affirmed in rare moments of abundance: a wedding, a good harvest, a saint's feast. In such moments, the hearth became something more, a stage for ceremony, memory, and meaning. Yet even these highs were tempered by the lows. Religious fasting was widespread and often lengthy, demanding not only spiritual discipline, but dietary adaptation. In a world with little refrigeration, feasting and fasting required careful planning and a deep respect for the fragile boundaries between plenty and peril. The feast when the pot overflowed. Feasts in early Anglo-Saxon England were not weekly affairs. Most rural households experienced communal gatherings only a few times a year, often tied to harvest festivals, religious holidays, or significant life events: births, marriages, or the building of a new hall. When a feast was called, neighbors and kin were invited. Everyone contributed. A slaughtered pig, barley bread, ale brewed weeks in advance, or preserved apples. Meat, rarely eaten on ordinary days, took center stage. Pork, mutton, sometimes beef roasted over open flames or boiled in vast iron cauldrons. Spits were turned by hand, slowly and steadily, while dogs circled hungrily. The scent of fat and smoke filled the village. Grain porridge was enriched with honey and herbs. Eggs were gathered in bundles and boiled. Cheeses, hard and salty, were sliced and served with nuts. Vegetables, usually relegated to the background, were flavored with vinegar or wild garlic and presented in bowls carved from horn or wood. There was music, usually lyres or bone flutes. Stories were told. Mead, when available, was passed around in shared cups. But beneath the celebration lay careful logistics: how to preserve the leftover meat, how to guard the ale, how not to waste. Because feasting for the poor could not be careless. Every scrap had a future use. Fast days and religious restrictions. Christianity brought with it a complex system of fasting and abstinence. By the 7th century, many Anglo-Saxon communities had adopted monastic-inspired food discipline, including Lent, Advent, and Friday abstinence. Meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden on fast days, a significant hardship in winter when fresh greens were scarce. Households turned instead to stored beans, onions, and flatbread. Fish became the ideal substitute: salted herring, dried eels, or smoked trout, depending on proximity to rivers or the coast. But fish was not always available. Inland villagers made do with mock meats, pottage made richer with barley, flavored with wild herbs or crushed nuts to simulate taste. In some areas, fermented grains or sour milk were used to mimic fuller flavors. Even wealthy estates kept separate inventories for fasting supplies: dried peas, lentils, almond flour, oil. These were used sparingly, as importing them was expensive. For the ordinary family, fasting was a test of planning more than piety. Those who failed to prepare found themselves hungry before the holy day even began. The role of women in food culture. Women were the central figures in early medieval food systems, not just in cooking, but in planting, preserving, and serving. They controlled the domestic garden: onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, and herbs. They managed chickens for eggs and goats for milk. They gathered firewood, maintained the hearth, stirred the pot, ground the grain, and watched for spoilage. Women also served as knowledge bearers: what to boil for a fever, how to ferment curds into cheese, when to salt pork, how long to air dry roots for winter storage. Their labor, often unseen in historical chronicles, underpinned the entire structure of food security. In Anglo-Saxon wills and charters, women were occasionally given specific bequests of cheese stores, ale rights, or butter barrels, signifying their ownership of domestic economy. One such will from the early 9th century includes the line, "To my daughter Edith, I give the cheese press and the winter barley from the lower granary." This speaks not just to inheritance but to expertise. The Lord's table and the servant's bowl. In larger halls, food served a political function. Lords and chieftains demonstrated their power through their ability to host and feed. Their tables were longer, their portions greater, and their plates sometimes metal or glass, rare luxuries imported through trade. But even then, the menu was modest by modern standards. A noble might enjoy roast meats, spiced wine flavored with herbs, and finer bread, yet the same pottage boiled in the kitchen. The differences were in quality, not structure. Servants, slaves, or bondwomen often ate from separate pots: thinner stews, older bread, less meat. Yet during feast days, the rules softened. All were expected to share in some form of abundance. It was both a moral obligation and a demonstration of generosity. To be fed was to be protected. To host a meal was to hold power. The language of food. Anglo-Saxon language reveals how central food was to life. The word lord comes from hlaford, meaning loaf giver. A lady was a hlafdige, literally, a kneader of loaves. These etymologies remind us that, in early English society, feeding others was not just practical, it was symbolic of leadership, provision, and status. Food terms were concrete and immediate. Brought bread, meat or food, ipel fruit, wheat and liquid. Many food words were borrowed from Latin as Christianity spread, especially for spices and more exotic items, though these were rare outside monasteries and royal courts. The very vocabulary of authority came from the hearth. Scarcity as a constant companion. Even in good years, hunger was never far away. A wet summer might rot barley. A poor winter might kill stored beans. Rats and mold could ruin a household's best-laid plans. Thus food was layered with anxiety. Families oversalted meat just in case. Dried apples were hidden under beds. Cheese was hung in rafters away from dogs. There were no backup plans. Crisis required creativity. In hard months, households turned to hunger foods: boiled nettle leaves, bark-infused bread, gruel made from ground acorns. These were bitter, unappetizing, but they kept the body moving. Monasteries occasionally offered alms: a crust of barley bread, a ladle of beans, but for most villagers, resilience came from within the home. And always the hearth remained sputtering, smoking, but never cold. An uncertain fullness. After the feast and fast, after the gathering and grinding, the Saxon household returned to routine. The pottage pot resumed its slow bubbling. The same leeks, the same barley, the same quiet. The meal was not memorable, that was the point. In its quiet repetition, food affirmed the possibility of another day. Not grand, not guaranteed, but enough. A kitchen without walls. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the Saxon hearth had changed little. Though more stone buildings appeared in noble households and churches grew in power and size, the ordinary family still cooked over open fires, still boiled pottage in soot-blackened pots, and still lived by the seasons. The kitchen, as a physical space, still did not exist for most households. Cooking was done at the center of the main living space. The smoke escaped through holes in the roof or simply filled the rafters, slowly blackening the beams. The smell of old stew, wet wool, and ash was as much a part of the home as the furniture. Yet this simplicity was not without subtle evolution. New crops arrived through trade and conquest. Lentils became more common. Certain herbs like coriander and dill made their way into monasteries, and within those monastic walls, more elaborate food preparation took place: baking, brewing, pickling. But for the average villager, the menu remained familiar. And the reason was simple: it worked. Hearth and identity. In the Anglo-Saxon worldview, the hearth was not only where meals were cooked, it was where stories were told, ancestors were remembered, and identities were affirmed. The fire was symbolic. It was protection against the chaos outside, both physical and spiritual. Pagan traditions had long treated fire as sacred. Even as Christianity spread, the symbolic role of the hearth endured. Food likewise carried meaning. A loaf of bread left as an offering, a joint of meat shared at Yuletide, a bowl of pottage stirred with the same spoon for decades. Feeding one's family was not only about nourishment, it was a declaration of presence, of survival, of continuity. The Norman disruption. When William the Conqueror took the English throne, he brought with him a new aristocracy, one that favored grander meals, more refined ingredients, and elaborate kitchen structures in castles and manors. But for the common folk, the change was gradual. Some foreign food terms entered the vocabulary: beef, pork, mutton, borrowed from the Norman French language of the ruling class. Interestingly, while the nobles ate buff, the peasants still raised and butchered oxen. These dual words, embedded in English to this day, reflect this social division. Yet the actual meals of rural households remained stubbornly Saxon. Barley bread, bean stew, smoked bacon, the same old songs, the same carved bowls. Only slowly did recipes shift. Ovens, once rare, became more common in village bakehouses. Communal milling became slightly more regulated, and written cookery began to appear not in peasant hands, but in monasteries and noble kitchens. Still, the taste of survival remained essentially unchanged. Survival techniques refined over generations. The food habits of early medieval households were not born of ignorance, they were honed over centuries of necessity. Ash bread made with ground acorns or coarse grain was a fallback that provided rough calories in lean years. Boiling rather than roasting preserved fuel and softened tough ingredients. Burying root vegetables in earthen pits allowed them to last through the winter. Storing cheese in linen soaked with vinegar kept it from molding. Sprinkling porridge with dried herbs not only improved taste, but offered medicinal benefits: chamomile for digestion, yarrow for fevers, garlic for strength. None of this was written down, but it was remembered. Echoes in modern kitchens. Many of the humble meals of Saxon England still echo faintly in rural English kitchens today. Stews thickened with barley, turnip soups, black bread, cheese wrapped in cloth, porridge in the morning. Even the concept of pottage lives on in dishes like Scotch broth, peas pudding, and vegetable stew. These are not just relics, they are links in an unbroken chain of sustenance. And perhaps more profoundly, the idea of the kitchen hearth as a central gathering place remains transformed but not erased. We may now have stovetops, ovens, and recipe books, but in every quiet, home-cooked meal, there is a faint warmth from fires long since cooled. Lessons in simplicity. The Saxon table teaches us not about luxury, but about resilience. It was never meant to impress. It was meant to nourish, to stretch what little could be gathered, stored, or grown into something shareable. It teaches that sustenance is not just about taste, but about endurance. That the rhythm of eating, however dull or repetitive, can be a form of comfort, a form of continuity, even a form of resistance. In their small, smoky homes, the Saxons did not plan to shape history, but they did by surviving. The quiet power of the hearth. At the center of the Saxon household was not a throne, not a desk, not a bed, but a fire. That fire cooked the grains that grew in a fickle climate. It warmed the hands of children after a day of chores. It smoked the meat that would last until the thaw. It was ordinary, it was essential, and it lasted. So the next time you stir a pot, break a loaf, or sit quietly with a humble meal, imagine the smoke of the hearth, the scraping of the spoon, the silence of a family at the edge of history. Not forgotten, just unseen. Story 4, The Cookshop Chronicles, London street food in the 1300s. The city wakes hungry. It is dawn in the city of London, sometime in the year 1327. The streets are slick with dew, the Thames sluggish and gray under low-hanging fog. Already, carts rattle down Cheapside. The air carries the sour scent of dung and river mud and something else: wood smoke, frying fat, and the rising tang of boiled offal. This is not the London of courts and crowns. This is the London of noise, smoke, and food. Here, amidst the thatched roofs and leaning timber houses, the cookshops open early, their hearths stoked, their iron pots already bubbling. People are hungry. The cookshop defined. A cookshop in medieval London was a modest operation, sometimes no more than a wooden stall near a busy corner, sometimes a permanent room at street level, often part of a cook's own dwelling. Cookshops were open-air kitchens where hot food could be bought and eaten quickly, and for those who didn't have access to a kitchen of their own, they were essential. These shops catered mostly to workers, students, travelers, and the urban poor people who could not always cook, or who could not afford the time or fuel to prepare hot meals at home. In a city of tenements, rented chambers, and constant motion, the cookshop filled the gap between subsistence and convenience. Their food wasn't elegant, but it was fast, hot, and affordable, three qualities that even in the 1300s ensured a steady stream of customers. What was on the menu? The fare of the average London cookshop was heavy, greasy, and designed to fill the belly more than delight the senses. Most offerings were based on meat stews, soups thickened with grain, and pies. One of the most common dishes was ragout, not the French version, but a basic meat stew flavored with onions, leeks, or garlic, boiled until soft and ladled into bowls or hollowed-out bread rounds. Pies were filled with whatever meat was available: minced pork, beef offcuts, liver, heart, kidney. Spices were rare and expensive, but pepper, sage, and mustard seeds were used when possible. More commonly, cooks relied on vinegar and salt. Fish was common, especially on Fridays or fast days. Fried eels, cheap, oily, and abundant from the Thames, were sold in great quantities. Herring, smoked or pickled, could be eaten with bread or porridge. Oat cakes, thick ale, and boiled beans rounded out the meal. And yes, there was gravy, not the smooth brown sauce of modern tables, but a ladle of meat drippings and broth poured over bread or porridge to add fat and flavor. The people who ate there. Not everyone in medieval London had access to a kitchen. Many people rented single rooms in larger houses or lived in boarding houses with no cooking facilities at all. For them, cookshops were a daily necessity. Apprentices, young boys training under craftsmen, often took their meals from the street. So did porters, dock workers, messengers, scribes, and day laborers. University students, often banned from keeping stoves or candles in their rooms, relied on cookshops for sustenance. So did unmarried workers and traveling merchants. Some of the poorer clergy, too, were regular customers. It was said that a penny spent at the cook saves three at the butcher. This was more than a proverb, it was a reality. Meat was expensive to buy raw, but stretched thin in stew or pie, it became affordable. And for those who could not afford even that, some cookshops gave away broth dregs or crusts near closing time. These acts of charity or shrewd PR earned them the grudging respect of the poor. Regulation and reputation. Despite their usefulness, cookshops were viewed with suspicion. They were regulated by the city's authorities, especially the assize of bread and ale, which sought to control the price and quality of food sold to the public. Cookshops were often inspected. A spoiled pie, a rotten stew, or watered-down ale could bring a fine or worse. Some were accused of dishonest practices, using bad meat, reheating old stew, or selling underweight portions. Complaints were lodged with the mayor's court. In one 1340 case, a cook was fined for mixing sawdust with pepper to stretch his spice blend. Cookshops also attracted crowds, noise, and occasionally crime. They were places where gossip flourished and tempers flared. Fights broke out over seating. Thieves mingled among diners. One chronicler complained that the cookshop was the devil's bench, where hot mouths bred cold sins. Still, they thrived because people needed to eat. Women in the cookshop world. While many cookshops were run by men, women also played a significant role. Widows and single women in particular could legally operate food stalls, bakehouses, and cookshops. City rolls list women like Alice LeCook, Agnes Pyewife, and Maud de Broth as proprietors. These women cooked, served, cleaned, and managed small teams of assistants. Some women specialized in baked goods, for example, while others ran broader stalls. A well-placed cookshop near a market or church could support a household. The presence of women added to the cookshop's communal atmosphere, part tavern, part kitchen, part newsstand. But it also brought scrutiny. Authorities often conflated female cooks with tavern keepers and, unfairly, with prostitution. This reflects less about the food and more about the nervousness of male authorities in the face of female independence. Nevertheless, women remained central to London's food streets, often the first to open in the morning and the last to bank their fires at night. The fire at the heart of it all. The cookshop revolved around one thing: the fire. In narrow streets with overhanging buildings and thatch roofs, fire was a constant threat. And yet, every cookshop required an open hearth, brazier, or oven. Fires were lit early, sometimes before dawn. Iron pots, blackened and battered, hung over flames or sat in cradles. Pies baked in clay ovens or domed lids covered with coals. Fat popped, wood hissed, and the air grew thick with soot and steam. There was no ventilation, no hood, no gloves. Burns were common, so were coughs from smoke inhalation. But for all its danger, fire made food hot, and that made it sell. A day in the life. Imagine a typical day in a 14th century London cookshop. Dawn, firelit, stew begun, ale tapped. A child sent to market for eels. Mid-morning, the first wave of customers. Apprentices and porters wolfing down meat pies with hands still dirty from labor. Noon, crowds from the guild halls arrive, seated on benches or standing elbow to elbow with travelers. Afternoon, bread sells out. The pot of broth is low, leftovers reboiled. Gravy gets stretched thinner. Evening, the shop quiets. A mother begs for crusts. The cook saves a bowl of stew for her own supper. Then ashes are scattered. The fire is banked. Tomorrow it begins again. Unresolved thought. As the cookshop shudders for the night and the fire cools in its hearth, one cannot help but wonder. Was this just sustenance or the beginning of something larger? A new way of eating, of living, of sharing space with strangers? Was the cookshop the first spark of the modern city? A city that eats together. By the mid-14th century, London had become a metropolis by medieval standards. Over 80,000 residents clustered along the Thames, surrounded by thick walls and narrow gates. In such a crowded city, food wasn't just eaten, it had to be managed, moved, and monetized. Cookshops helped do all three. As urban life accelerated, with workers leaving home before sunrise and returning after dark, home-cooked meals became a luxury. Many Londoners relied on a network of cooks, bakers, brewers, and pie sellers for their daily nourishment. These professionals didn't just offer food, they offered time, space, and heat that their customers could not afford to maintain on their own. The city government, guilds, and religious institutions all understood the importance of this food economy and sought to control it. The regulation of appetite. In 14th century London, the freedom to cook and sell food was constrained by guild rules, city ordinances, and an ever-growing concern about public health. Cookshops were subject to inspections, particularly after a string of food-related incidents. Spoiled meat sold in stews, tavern ale watered beyond recognition, and public illness traced back to poor sanitation. The assize of bread and ale, first implemented in 1266 and regularly reissued, was designed to prevent fraud and ensure minimum food standards. Cooks caught selling underweight pies or tainted meat could be fined, pilloried, or in cases of repeated offenses banned from trade. For example, one court record from 1331 tells of a cook in Eastcheap who sold pottage of fowl entrails unfit for Christian consumption. He was fined 2 shillings and had his stall torn down. But not all regulation was punitive. In some cases, city authorities encouraged cookshops to serve the poor, especially during religious festivals or in times of scarcity. During famine years, the mayor might order the reopening of soup kitchens and require wealthier cookshops to contribute broth and bread. Regulation, therefore, was both restriction and recognition. What the rich bought from the poor. Interestingly, cookshops served a wide range of customers. While the poor depended on them for daily meals, The wealthy occasionally purchased food from them too, particularly during emergencies or while traveling. A wealthy merchant, arriving in London late, might send his servant to a cookshop for a hot meat pie or a bowl of stew. Even minor nobles, lodged at inns near the city gates, relied on local cooks for fish and ale. There was even a class of hireable cooks, trained professionals who could be employed for feast days or guild events. They brought their own knives, spices, and sometimes assistants. Cookshop workers, having honed their skills under fire, often graduated into these roles. This gave some upward mobility to the best cooks. A few went on to manage large kitchens in inns or even in royal households. But for most, the cookshop was a final profession, not a stepping stone. The pie seller and the public taste. No single item defined the cookshop more than the pie. Medieval pies were nothing like modern dessert pastries. They were heavy, meat-filled, and often sealed in thick, inedible crusts known as coffins, containers made to withstand long cooking, not to be eaten. A cookshop pie might be filled with chopped pork, beef, or offal, heavily salted and sometimes spiced. On Fridays or during Lent, fish pies, usually herring or eel, were common. Pies were portable, cheap, and durable, making them ideal for workers and travelers. One surviving city roll mentions a pie whiff, a female pie vendor who was fined for selling pies of inferior meat to clerks near St. Paul. Yet despite regulation, the public craved pies. Their smell filled the streets. Their fat-soaked crusts, though not always eaten, carried the rich scent of protein and pepper. And at a time when food was rarely varied, the pie offered choice and the illusion of luxury. The cookshop as meeting place. Aside from food, cookshops served a crucial social function. In a world without restaurants or cafes, the cookshop was one of the only public places where different classes mixed. Artisans, scribes, porters, and even students from the nearby Inns of Court might find themselves eating side by side, hunched over steaming trenchers or waiting for a cut of meat. It was not always civil. Arguments broke out. Knives were drawn. But gossip flowed more easily than blood, and news passed from mouth to mouth alongside broth and bread. Cookshops near the city's gates became known gathering points for rural sellers, travelers, and pilgrims. Near markets, they became extensions of commerce places where buyers and sellers negotiated over a midday pie. Some even say that certain sermons were drafted, debts settled, and minor crimes plotted over stew-laden benches. The cookshop then was not only a kitchen, it was a mirror of the city itself, crowded, hot, and full of life. Women work and the cooked economy. For many women, especially widows or the unmarried, the cookshop offered rare economic agency. While guilds often excluded women from full membership, food vending remained one of the few legally accepted trades for women in cities like London. A widow might inherit her husband's cooking stall. A young woman might operate a bread or pie stall with her mother. These women controlled small but critical parts of the urban food chain. The morning meat pies near the smithy, the afternoon fish stew by the docks, the dried apple cakes outside St. Mary Woolnoth. Though rarely mentioned by name, they appear in court rolls, tax ledgers, and occasional satire. One poem mocks a pie whiff for charging double during Lent, but also concedes that her pies smelled of kingly meat. In these small, smoky corners, women shaped the flavor of the city. Sound, smell, and saturation. To walk through a London street at midday in the 1300s was to be immersed in cookery. The hiss of fat on the pan, the bubbling of meat in a cauldron, the low drone of sellers calling out, "Hot pottage, hot meat, pie for a penny." You would smell onions long before you saw the stall, bread baked in communal ovens, eels fried whole in shallow lard, turnips and cabbage simmered into thick stews, ale casks cracked open. It was noisy, messy, and relentless. But for many, it was the smell of comfort of work rewarded, of bellies filled. It meant the fire still burned, the city still moved, and hunger for now was held at bay. A place in the urban machine. Cookshops were vital components of urban survival. They fed the laborers who built walls, the clerks who copied laws, the boys who carried water. And in return, the city gave them just enough space to exist within regulation, beneath suspicion, always slightly on the edge. But they endured. They simmered through storms, famines, and plagues. They reopened after fires. They passed down recipes, stalls, and ladles from one generation to the next. Their history is not found in royal ledgers or illuminated manuscripts. It is found in the charred rim of an iron pot, in the knife-scratched counter of a wooden stall, in the old bones of eels buried behind an inn. Unresolved thought. As dusk settles and the last ladle of stew is poured, we are left with a question. Did the cookshop change to serve the city, or did the city change around the cookshop? Cookshops through crisis. The mid-1300s brought catastrophe to London. In 1348, the Black Death arrived, and with it came a silence more profound than any ordinance or curfew. The city's population was halved, markets emptied, guilds staggered, streets that once buzzed with pie sellers and stew criers became corridors of fear. But even as the plague hollowed homes and silenced sermons, the cookshops did not disappear entirely. Some shut down, others were shuttered by law, but a few continued, serving gruel to gravediggers, broth to monks, and crusts to the few hungry and living who dared venture out. Chroniclers mention food being given through windows, stew ladled into bowls held at a distance, and cookshop wives weeping behind hanging cloths soaked in vinegar, their improvised protection against the invisible. In these darkest of days, food remained the last ritual of continuity. Even when prayers failed, even when physicians fled, people still sought a bowl of something warm. And the cookshop, resilient and adaptable, survived. Fire and fat after the plague. When the plague waned and London began to breathe again, cookshops re-emerged into a changed city. Wages rose due to labor shortages. The working poor had slightly more coin to spend, and many who had survived, especially women, found new independence. Some widows reopened their husbands' stalls. Others claimed abandoned spots or petitioned for cookery rights from the city. The demand for food grew, so did expectations. More variety appeared on menus. Sweet buns made with honey and dried fruit, spiced pies for holy days, pottage thickened with milk or ale. Some cookshops even experimented with sauces, sour cherries, mustard seeds, vinegar reduction. The profession itself began to stratify. Some cooks worked stalls, others leased space in permanent buildings, operating small taverns or inns. A few grew wealthy enough to train apprentices or sell to wealthier clientele. But always the smell of onions and fat, the hiss of dripping tallow, the rhythm of the ladle, these remained unchanged. The rise of the public table. What was once eaten standing on a street corner now sometimes had a table. By the late 14th century, cookshops in larger towns began to install benches or counters. Some offered shared seating, others standing room indoors to escape the rain. These weren't restaurants, not yet, but they were steps in that direction. The idea of buying cooked food, eating among strangers, and sharing not just a dish, but a space was becoming normalized. These simple places forged a new kind of public, not noble, not familial, but urban. People gathered not by blood or profession, but by appetite and proximity. In many ways, the cookshop became the prototype for the modern city diner, the food stall, the lunch counter, a place where hunger made equals at least for a few bites. Moral panic and cook temptations. Not everyone viewed this development kindly. Sermons and city statutes occasionally warned against the sinfulness of public food. Cookshops were seen as noisy, disorderly, and morally ambiguous, particularly those run by women or situated near ale cellars. One preacher described them as furnaces of sloth, where men lingered too long, drank too deep, and lost their sense of purpose. Another tract warned that idle food led to idle thoughts and, eventually, to sin. Behind these warnings was a deeper fear: the erosion of household order, the mixing of classes, and the rise of an independent food economy beyond the reach of patriarchs and priests. But the people kept coming. Because the stew was hot, the bread was fresh, the pie cost only a penny, and hunger then as now outweighed morality. Memory in the pot. The true legacy of the cookshop lies not in architecture or law, but in continuity. Long after individual stalls were closed, rebuilt, or forgotten, their methods lived on. The portable pie became the hand pie, and eventually the Cornish pasty. Broths thickened with barley or peas evolved into traditional soups like peas pudding. Street sellers of eel endured well into the 1800s. The pairing of hot food with shared benches survived into the 20th century lunch counters of industrial cities. Even phrases lingered: penny pie, potluck, street fair. The cookshop fed not just bodies, but language. A woman's ladle, a city's backbone. The anonymous women of London's cookshops, the Agneses and Mauds, the unnamed pie wives and stew maidens, played a foundational role in feeding a growing city. They were never praised in chronicles. Their names don't appear in stained glass or gilded charters, but their labor, daily, smoky, and endlessly repeated, sustained the population. They cooked through plague, famine, war, and winter. They stirred pots before sunrise and sold pies until sundown. They burned their hands, lost their stalls, argued with inspectors, and fed the hungry anyway. History remembers kings, but it was women with ladles who kept the streets alive. A final look at the stall. Picture it now, the last hour before dark. The pot is nearly empty, the crusts are hardened, the bench is wiped with a rag. The cook exhales, her apron is stained, her eyes are tired, but her stall will open again tomorrow. Because London is hungry, and someone must feed it. Final reflection. From alley-side cauldrons to takeaway stalls and corner shops, the story of the cookshop is the story of survival under pressure, of adapting to cramped spaces, stretched coins, and uncertain tomorrows. It's the story of those who fed others, without asking questions, only for pennies and a place in the life of the city. And in every street vendor, in every hot pie sold from a window, the ember still glows. The cookshop endures. Story 5, A Pig for Winter, Peasant Slaughter Feasts and Communal Butchery. The Pig and the Peasant. It is late October in the year 1289. The first frost has hardened the ground of a small village in the Rhineland. Smoke curls from low chimneys. Cabbage fields lie bare. The grain is already stored, and potatoes not yet introduced from the New World are unknown. But one critical task remains before winter settles in for good: the slaughter of the pig. For the medieval peasant, the pig was not just meat. It was the embodiment of survival: protein, fat, salt, warmth, glue, candles, and comfort. To kill the pig was to prepare for winter. To not kill it, or to kill it at the wrong time, was to risk starvation. Unlike modern industrial slaughter, medieval pig killing was intensely seasonal, deeply communal, and often ritualized. It was part feast, part labor, part inheritance of ancient custom. And it was one of the most significant and most dreaded days of the peasant year. Why autumn? Pigs were slaughtered in late autumn for several practical reasons. Temperature. The cool weather slowed spoilage and made it possible to cure meat before it could rot. Feed scarcity. With crops harvested and root cellars full, there was no surplus grain or fodder to keep animals fed through winter. Fat content. Pigs fattened en masse, Fallen acorns, chestnuts, and forest forage were at their plumpest in late October or early November. Communal labor. After the harvest but before the deep freeze, villagers had a small window of relative time and the need to focus on butchery. This period, known in some regions as Schlachtzeit or slaughter time, was as much a part of the peasant calendar as planting or reaping. The day of the kill. The day began early. The pig, often kept in a small pen or tethered to a post, was led to a cleared area behind the cottage or at the village edge. Sometimes the pig was stunned first with a hammer or club. In other cases, the kill was made with a single knife thrust to the neck or heart. It was a grim and necessary act, usually done by the head of the household or an experienced neighbor. Blood was collected in large bowls not to be wasted and immediately stirred to keep it from coagulating. Blood would be used in sausages, puddings, or baked into rye loaves. The carcass was hung by its hind legs and bled fully. Then came the scalding. Hot water was poured or the body dunked into a barrel to loosen bristles, which were then scraped off with knives or wood scrapers. The body was split, the organs removed. The butchery began. Nothing was wasted. The economy of the medieval pig was total. From snout to tail, every part had its use. Meat, salted or smoked for preservation. Some joints were cooked immediately. Fat, rendered into lard for cooking and lighting. Blood, used for blood sausage, blutwurst, black pudding or baked goods. Bones, boiled for broth. Larger ones used as tools or even toys. Organs, liver, lungs, heart, and kidneys were eaten fresh, considered both nutritious and, in some places, delicacies. Bladder, cleaned and inflated for use as a container or a child's ball. Bristles, used for brushes or trade. Skin, used in shoes, thongs, or parchment binding. Preservation had to begin immediately. Meat was packed in salt, smoked in lofts above the fire, or submerged in brine. Hams might be hung in chimneys. Sausages were stuffed using intestines, twisted and hung in long chains. Women typically led the processing, scraping, salting, boiling, packing. It was exhausting, greasy, and essential work. Communal butchery. In many villages, butchery was a shared labor. Not every family owned a pig. Some rented them. Others bought only part of a pig, sharing the cost and the yield. Neighbors helped one another with slaughter, smoking, and stuffing, and in return, shared in the bounty. A common arrangement might see one pig shared between 3 households. One family killed and cleaned, another prepared the sausages, the third hosted a small feast to celebrate the end of the process. Children were often sent to help or observe, learning by watching, mimicking the tasks in small ways, stirring blood, turning the meat grinder, carrying salted meat to storage. In some regions, the local lord or abbey claimed a portion of each slaughter, a leg, a head, a share of the fat. This right, called pannage or banal meat tax, was resented, but rarely avoided. The slaughter feast. Not all of the pig was preserved. Certain parts, liver, fresh fat, kidneys, ribs, were cooked the same day. A small feast followed the kill, equal parts celebration and gratitude. The family might boil a portion with onions, serve it with cabbage or barley mash, and offer bowls to neighbors who had helped. Ale would be poured, bread passed around. Children, still sticky from work, would gnaw on bones. This meal, simple and rich, marked a turning point. It was the last fresh meat many would taste for months. From here on, meat would be dried, smoked, or stretched with legumes. The feast was also a statement. We have killed, we have stored, we are ready for winter. Fear of spoilage. Despite careful preparation, the threat of spoilage loomed. Salt was expensive and not always reliable. Smoke curing took days and required constant tending. A damp cellar, a cracked cask, or a moldy storage cloth could ruin a season's supply. People checked their stores constantly. They sniffed, prodded, and sometimes recured meat midwinter. Some stored smoked sausages in barrels of ash. Others wrapped them in waxed cloth or suspended them from ceilings. And yet losses happened. Rats chewed, mold bloomed, famine crept in through careless error. The memory of spoiled meat haunted many households. Tales were told of families forced to eat rotten pork or bury it while children cried. This fear gave slaughter time a deep seriousness. It was not just a chore, it was a hedge against ruin. The season shift. By mid-November the kill was done. Smokehouses still glowed, barrels brimmed with salted cuts. The village air smelled of fat and fire. And so the village entered winter armed with bacon, broth, bones, lard, and sausages. The work was not over, but the hardest cut had been made. The pig raised, fattened, and finally butchered had become a winter larder, a story, a shared memory. Unresolved thought. As snow dusts the roof and the last sausages are hung in the smokehouse rafters, one wonders, how many winters did a single pig hold at bay, and what stories lingered in its absence? The winter larder. It is now mid-December in the same small Rhineland village. Snow has begun to settle in quiet drifts along the stone paths. The fields lie still and the trees are bare. Inside homes, hearths burn low and slow, but hanging above them in the rafters or in small smokehouses are sausages, ribs, and cured hams, the yield of the autumn slaughter. The pig is now no longer visible, but it is everywhere. Its fat hisses in the pan each morning, stirred into barley porridge. Its bones simmer in the evening broth. Its lard is smeared on bread, on boots, and even in medicinal pastes. It appears in dreams and in calculations. How long will it last? What must be rationed? To have pork in the rafters was to have hope. To have none was to knock on a neighbor's door, or worse, to consider selling what little remained. Salt, smoke, and survival. Preservation wasn't a guarantee. It was a gamble played against nature. Salted pork was packed tightly into barrels, layered with coarse salt. This slowed bacterial growth and drew moisture out. Each week, someone, often a child, would open the barrel and inspect the meat. If rot appeared, they cut it off. If the brine looked low, they boiled and added more. Smoked meat hung for days or weeks in the smokehouse, a low, often windowless hut built from clay or timber. Fires burned green wood, beech, oak, sometimes juniper, producing thick smoke. The meat took on a dark skin, dried slowly, and absorbed the scent of fire. Different cuts required different treatments. Hams were cured longest up to several months. Sausages might be ready within weeks, but were eaten first. Fatback and jowl were highly prized, especially for rendering lard. The lard, once rendered in iron pots, was poured into ceramic pots and sealed with a cloth. It would be scooped out all winter to fry, to coat bread, or to add depth to otherwise flavorless grain meals. Fat was survival. Fat meant warmth, energy, fertility, and endurance. In a peasant's winter, calories were currency. Pork as economy. Preserved pork wasn't just food, it was a form of exchange. In villages where coins were scarce, people bartered with food. A half-dozen sausages could buy a bushel of barley. A smoked ham might be traded for firewood or cloth. Lard was especially valuable, sold by the ladle in markets. This made pork both sustenance and asset. Families tracked it carefully. If they slaughtered 2 pigs, they might sell half the meat to finance shoes or pay a tax. The local manor might demand pork as part of rent, a tradition that dated back centuries. In England, some tenants were required to offer a side of bacon annually, a practice that lingered into the Tudor period. In some regions, communal ovens or salt houses were built and maintained for village use. These spaces became negotiation grounds, gossip stations, and quiet battlefields over who owed what. Pork was protein and politics. Gender and the butchery chain. While the actual killing of the pig was usually a man's duty, nearly every other part of the preservation process was handled by women. They salted, stirred, stuffed, scraped, packed, and preserved. They decided when to cut into the barrel, which pieces to save for Christmas, and which to trade. They knew how long a sausage could hang before drying too hard, and how to boil a brined piece of shoulder into something soft enough for a toothless elder to chew. They taught daughters how to twist intestines into casings. They explained why the blood must be stirred constantly, or it would clot. They marked the hams with herbs to ward off flies. In the stories passed down, the pig may have been killed by the father, but it was saved by the mother. The Midwinter Feast. Pork shaped the feast table in winter, most notably during Christmas. Even in poor households, some portion of the pig was reserved for midwinter, a joint of meat, a small ham, or a string of sausages. These were served with dried apples, onions, barley bread, and ale or cider. In some regions, the boar's head was paraded, a custom that originated in pagan winter feasts and lingered in noble halls. The symbolism was powerful. To eat pork at midwinter was to say, "We have enough." It was also a prayer, "May this meat carry us to spring." Leftovers were guarded closely. Bones were boiled again. Fat was scraped into pots. No part was wasted. This meal, heavy, fatty, fragrant, was both celebration and calculation. Sacred swine, belief in the pig. Pigs had long been linked to ritual in European cultures. In pre-Christian times, they were sacrificed during solstice rites, seen as symbols of fertility, strength, and regeneration. Christianity absorbed and transformed many of these customs. Saints' days were sometimes celebrated with pork feasts. The pig remained a creature of the threshold, domestic, dirty, and yet precious. But not all associations were favorable. In later medieval sermons, pigs often symbolized sin, gluttony, lust, laziness. The pig, bloated and low to the ground, became an image of excess. Monks warned against feeding the swine within. Yet in daily life these metaphors held little sway. The pig was a neighbor, a promise, a presence. Even as theology shifted, the peasant's need remained. Communal risk, communal reward. In some villages, multiple families pooled resources to buy and raise a pig. They shared in feeding it scraps, grain husks, peelings. Children gave it names. When slaughter day came, everyone attended. One man killed, one woman stirred the blood, one cleaned the intestines, others carried meat to the salt bins. The yield was weighed, measured, and divided, sometimes equally, sometimes by contract. Disputes occasionally erupted. Accusations of cheating, of hiding choice cuts, or of withholding fat. But more often, the event bound the village. It reinforced bonds of mutual aid. It created shared memory and a sense that survival was not a solitary endeavor. Times hunger. By late February, the pork stores began to thin. The sausage ropes were shorter, the brine casks lighter, fat scraped from the sides of pots, bones boiled a second time, hams cut thinner. There was no panic, only patience. Lent approached. Fasting would stretch the final rations. Spring greens would arrive soon. But until then, each meal was a slow reduction, a quiet sacrifice. The pig had done its part. The rest was up to the season and the will to endure. Unresolved thought. As the smokehouse stands empty and the last crust of lard is spread on barley bread, one question lingers. In the long arc of hunger and hope, was the pig a meal or a memory stitched into the rhythm of life itself? Bones in the ash. By late March, the smokehouse is silent. The last of the sausages have been eaten, the salt barrel scraped to the bottom. The brine smells slightly sour now. The bones, once boiled and reboiled, lie in a bucket near the hearth. Soon, they'll be crushed and added to the garden soil, returned to the ground that grew the grain that once fed the pig. This is the natural end to the pig's winter journey, from oink to ash, from feast to famine. But what remains? A bone or two, yes. A faint aroma in the rafters. perhaps a spot on the wall where fat once spat. Yet more than that, what's left behind is the pig as memory, an animal that was at once mundane and mythic, forgettable in life but unforgettable in the hunger it held at bay. Pigs in law and custom. The importance of the pig extended far beyond diet. It shaped law, land use, and social expectations. In medieval England, Germany, and parts of France, local lords often retained special rights over pigs and the woods they foraged in. These rights, known as pannage, allowed swine to be turned loose in the forest each autumn to feed on acorns and beech nuts. But pannage was not free. Peasants paid a fee in coin, meat, or labor to allow their pigs to graze. In the New Forest of England, these laws were codified in detail as early as the 11th century, and some still survive today in ceremonial form. Pigs were also used as rent payments. A family might owe their lord one fat pig yearly, delivered by Martinmas, November 11th, often the traditional end of the slaughter season. Failure to deliver could result in eviction or additional labor service. Disputes over pigs who owned them, who had slaughter rights, whether they were stolen, appear regularly in manorial court rolls. In one 14th century case, a man was fined for hiding a slaughtered pig from the reeve and failing to declare the meat for tax. Even the right to eat pig marked social status. The flitch of bacon. In some English towns, a curious custom developed: the awarding of a flitch of bacon, a side of cured pork, to any married couple who could swear, publicly and under oath, that they had not quarreled in a year and a day. Though mostly symbolic and subject to much public laughter, the ritual tells us something important. Bacon was not just meat. It was honor. It was reward. It was a public symbol of virtue, peace, and provision. The fact that this prize was pork, and not coin or grain, reflects its perceived value. A flitch of bacon meant weeks of food, comfort, and perhaps most importantly, security. Pigs and peasant identity. To outsiders, nobles, clergy, chroniclers, the pig was often used as a symbol of peasant crudity. In illuminated manuscripts, peasants are drawn wallowing with their pigs. Sermons refer to villagers as swineherds, metaphorically and literally. But within the village itself, the pig was not an insult, it was a companion. It lived close to the house. It ate what the family ate: scraps, porridge, vegetable peelings. It was sometimes named. It was sometimes even mourned. And because it was tied to the slaughter season, it marked time in a way that few things could. Children knew the year by how many pigs were raised. Elders counted the quality of a winter by how long the meat had lasted. A 2-pig year meant surplus. A no-pig year meant hunger. In a world where calendars were rare, pigs helped count the rhythm of life. Superstition and folklore. The slaughter of a pig, though practical, was also laced with superstition. In parts of Germany, it was considered bad luck to kill a pig on a Monday. In parts of France, a sprig of rosemary was hung in the smokehouse to ward off spoilage. Blood spilt from the pig was sometimes smeared on thresholds or fences to protect the household. The pig's tail, if twisted into a loop, was hung over the door to bring fertility. Pigs also appeared in dreams, often as warnings. A squealing pig might foretell misfortune, a quiet one prosperity. In stories, pigs walked upright, spoke to saints, or escaped death through cleverness. One legend tells of a pig who fled the butcher and led villagers to a hidden spring during a drought. In return, the spring was named after him, and the villagers never ate pork again. These tales reflect both the pig's familiarity and its fragility. It was ordinary yet strangely significant. Changing times. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, changes began to affect the pig's role in the rural household. Population growth meant more demand for meat and more commercial pig rearing. Urban markets created space for professional butchers, lessening reliance on home slaughter. Trade and preservation methods improved. introducing spices and techniques that reshaped the flavor and form of pork. Religious reformers, especially later Protestants, frowned on excessive feast days and rituals tied to animal slaughter. But even as systems changed, the basic rhythm endured in villages: raise, feed, kill, preserve, survive. The pig never disappeared. It merely became part of a larger economy and then, slowly, a national cuisine. The pig in the pantry. For hundreds of years, the image of the hanging ham, the sausage rope, the lard pot all remained fixtures in European peasant homes. Even today, remnants linger. In Germany, the word Schlachtfest still refers to a village pig-killing celebration. In England, traditional blood pudding and black sausage descend from medieval recipes. In Italy, rural festivals revolve around the making of cured pork products, all echoing centuries of autumn work. And in phrases like bringing home the bacon, living high on the hog, or a pig in a poke, the medieval relationship to pork still snorts quietly behind the words. A final winter thought. There is something humbling in how much rested on a single animal. A year of feeding, a week of slaughter, a season of preservation, and finally a winter's hope. The pig was never merely meat. It was continuity, resilience, and ritual. It was life compressed into fat and smoke and salt. And though its squeal faded quickly on slaughter day, its memory hung in the rafters and stayed there, quietly, until the thaw. Story 6. Venison and Vinegar, Feasting at a Medieval Noble's Table. Where the feast begins. It is the year 1371, and you are standing in the outer courtyard of a noble estate in the English countryside. Inside the manor, a timber-framed, stone-walled complex surrounded by pasture and guarded gates, a feast is being prepared. Not a casual dinner, but a formal, orchestrated display of wealth, honor, and duty. The Lord has called for guests: minor knights, landholding tenants, neighboring clergy, a royal official. The reason? It hardly matters. A hunting triumph, a birth, a visiting cousin, any excuse will do. Because in the world of the medieval nobility, a feast is never just a meal. It is theater. It is an act of political self-definition, an economic event, and a spiritual statement. It is proof served in courses, garnished in gold, and narrated in meat and mead that the world still turns under the rule of God and Lord alike. But long before the guests arrive, the true work begins in the kitchen. The noble kitchen as battlefield. Medieval noble households employed dozens, sometimes hundreds of staff. Many of them were assigned to the kitchen. In a large estate, the kitchen was not a single room but an ecosystem, divided into specialized offices. The kitchen coquina, for boiling, roasting, baking. The pantry paneteria, for bread and table linens. The buttery butyleria, for wine, ale, and drinking vessels. The larder lardarium, for meat storage and curing. The scullery scullaria, for cleaning pots, dishes, and tools. The pastry house, for pies, tarts, and flour-based work. At the center was the master cook, often assisted by a second cook and a team of assistants, turnspits, and helpers. Above him was the steward, who oversaw the entire household and managed provisioning. The fire never went out. Roasting alone required multiple spits and constant turning, often done by young boys or specially trained servants, whose faces turned red from the heat, day after day. And while the Lord might sip spiced wine and gossip with his clerical guest, his meal was enabled by hours of prep, sweat, and soot far from the great hall. Procuring the ingredients of power. The nobleman's table required more than flour and salt pork. Venison, boar, hare, swan, pheasant, and partridge were prized meats, often from the Lord's own hunting grounds. Forest law forbade commoners from hunting deer. Poachers could be maimed or killed. But the noble had license and took pride in displaying the bounty of the chase. Beef and mutton were also consumed, especially in winter when dried or salted. Fish, both freshwater and sea varieties, were critical for fast days. A noble household might purchase live eels, imported herring, or preserved lampreys. Fish ponds were common on estates, tended like treasure chests. Vegetables were considered lower fare but included onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, and cabbage. Fruits were often cooked into sauces or pies. Apples, pears, and berries gathered from estate orchards or purchased from monastic growers. Spices, however, were the defining luxury. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, saffron, ginger, all imported via long and dangerous trade routes, were added liberally, not to disguise rot, a myth, but to demonstrate sophistication and expense. The kitchen was a treasury, and each ingredient a coin of taste and influence. Menu as messe. The typical noble feast was arranged in courses, though the structure varied across time and region. A mid-level feast might include: first course, stewed beef, roast venison, hot pies, spiced wine. Second course, boiled fowl, fried fish, seasoned vegetables, cheese tarts. Subtlety or entremet. A sculpted display, a pie shaped like a castle, a roast peacock redressed in its own feathers, or a molded jelly in 3 colors. Final course, spiced wafers, candied nuts, fruit and syrup, and hippocras, sweetened, spiced wine. There was no individualized plating. Dishes were brought out in bulk and served to the table. Hierarchy dictated access. The lord received the best cuts. The guests shared according to rank. The lower tables received what was left. The message was clear: order flows through food. The hall estate. The great hall was the center of noble life. It doubled as dining room, court, chapel, and ceremonial space. At feasts, the lord sat at the high table, often elevated on a dais. Guests sat below, arranged by rank. Behind them, servants moved quickly but silently, pouring drink, carving meat, and replacing trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. Table manners were critical. No elbows, no slurping, no wiping one's mouth on the tablecloth. Diners shared cups and knives. Forks were rare and considered foreign. One was expected to take small bites, offer food to one's neighbor, and not speak with a full mouth. Music was played, poems recited. In some cases, trained falcons were displayed or jesters performed. But all eyes occasionally turned to the food: the gleaming boar, the colorful entremet, the rare dish of lampreys in vinegar and saw, not supper, but spectacle. Leftovers, redistribution, and symbolic generosity. At the end of the feast, not everything was eaten by design. Leftovers were carefully gathered. Some went to household servants, some to the almoner, an officer responsible for distributing food to the poor. It was common for beggars to wait outside the gates during a feast, hopeful for bones, bread, or fat scraps. This redistribution was not purely charitable. It reinforced the lord's image as provider, a mini-king in his domain, responsible for both spectacle and sustenance. Food thus extended the noble's power from the table to the village and back again. The cost of splendor. Feasts were expensive. A 3-day event might consume 10 oxen, 40 pigs, 100 chickens, 60 gallons of wine, pounds of cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, dozens of pies and tarts, several barrels of ale. And that didn't count firewood, labor, transport, and cleanup. Feasts could bankrupt a minor noble. Some did. Others used them to secure alliances, cement loyalty, or impress royal inspectors. The noble did not feast alone, he feasted upward. Unresolved thought. As the torches sputter low and the final wine cup is passed, a thought remains. Was this abundance a reward or a performance? And if the table spoke power, what happened when the food began to run short? The rules of the table. By the 14th century, noble feasting had become more than a tradition, it was a codified ritual. Manuscripts such as the Livre des Manières, or the Book of Courtesy laid out detailed expectations for how one should behave while eating. Do not blow your nose in the tablecloth. Do not scratch your head or your neighbor while the food is being served. If you spit, do so onto the table. Chew silently. Do not stare at others while they eat. These rules may seem odd or even humorous today, but they matter deeply. In a world defined by hierarchy and ritual, how one behaved at the table could determine one's future. A knight might secure favor with his lord through deference and grace. A squire might ruin his prospects with a single, greasy blunder. To dine was to perform one's place in the social order publicly, visibly, and with full awareness of who was watching. Power in the seating plan. Where you sat mattered. The high table was reserved for the lord, lady, and honored guests. The upper table included trusted stewards, high-ranking clergy, or visiting knights. The lower benches held minor retainers, scribes, pages, and household staff. The floor, or adjoining rooms, were often for lower servants or workers who ate later. A guest's place could subtly communicate alliance, suspicion, or reward. To be seated closer to the lord was to be seen as a confidant. To be seated further away or to not be invited at all could be a gentle, public rebuke. There were no printed place cards. The steward assigned seating based on shifting politics and whispered priorities. And everyone noticed. The forked debate. Forks began appearing in Western Europe around the 11th century, introduced via Byzantine influence. But they were controversial. In many noble courts, especially in England and France, forks were viewed as effeminate, foreign, or even sinful. Churchmen denounced their use as vanity. Why, they asked, would one need metal prongs to touch the food God gave hands for? Still, by the 14th and 15th centuries, forks began appearing in Italian courts, particularly for sweet or sticky foods. Guests who used them were watched closely. Did they show refinement or arrogance? In this way, the very tool of eating became a test of cultural affiliation, orthodoxy, and innovation. The performance of gluttony and restraint. Feasts were excessive by nature, yet nobles were expected to display moderation while consuming them. One might be offered 3 meats and 5 sauces, but to heap one's plate too generously would mark a guest as vulgar. Conversely, refusing everything might signal insult. Thus, nobles learned a delicate dance. Take a little. Compliment loudly. Chew slowly. Offer some to your neighbor. Drink enough to show participation, but not enough to slur. Gluttony was condemned in sermons, and mocked in art. The image of the fat noble with greasy fingers, red face, and fallen buttons was common in satire. Yet starvation was feared, and abstinence rarely admired in practice. The ideal noble dined with elegance, appetite, and control, a ruler of his desires as well as his estate. Symbolism in the dishes. Feasts told stories. Each dish could carry symbolic weight. Boar's head signified strength and wild conquest. Peacock served in its feathers symbolized vanity, divine favor, and pageantry. Lamprey and spiced wine indicated wealth, as these fish were difficult to procure and expensive. Venison pies highlighted the lord's exclusive rights to forest game. Even color mattered. Dishes dyed with saffron or parsley were more than beautiful, they displayed the house's access to rare spices. Some dishes were served more for display than consumption. These were known as entremets, elaborate creations of sugar, pastry, or molded jelly made to resemble castles, dragons, saints, or allegories. In one recorded feast, an entire ship made of pastry floated across the table, filled with sugared fruits and musicians hidden inside. The feast as political statement. Behind the plates and pies lay strategy. Noble feasts served to reward loyalty among vassals and retainers, forge alliances through shared hospitality, impress visitors from rival houses or foreign courts, display religious piety, especially during saints' feast days or monastic jubilees, reaffirm order during times of political instability or local unrest. A well-run feast signaled that the Lord had resources, organization, and control. To host poorly, to run out of wine, serve cold meat, or forget the seating order was to risk appearing weak. Some lords borrowed heavily to host banquets they could not afford. Hopping the show of splendor would distract from debt or discord. Others kept feasts modest, but structured with precision, ensuring that even a small spread was an echo of divine and earthly order. Hidden labor and social tensions. What the guests did not see was the world below the feast, the kitchen hierarchy, the servants' mess, and the invisible chain of labor that made it all possible. Turnspit boys worked in searing heat. Scullions scrubbed pots for hours with sand and lye. Carvers practiced exact cuts, trained for years to slice meat with elegance. Pantry boys folded tablecloths in silence. There was status even here. The carver, the cupbearer, and the server were often young noblemen in training, apprenticing in proximity to power. But the cooks, the washerwomen, the stable hands who fetched extra ale at midnight, their reward was often only food scraps and sore feet. And yet, should one spit in the wine or burn the roast, the entire structure might falter. The feast, like the manor, stood on a precarious web of human tension bound together with salt, sweat, and silence. The end of the evening. As the fire dimmed, the music softened. Guests grew quiet or drowsy. Those who lived nearby might stumble home. Others would be led to guest chambers. The Lord, perhaps emboldened by Hippocrates, might make a final toast before retiring to his solar. The hall was swept, tablecloths were folded, leftovers sorted, the wine jugs refilled and stoppered. And in the cool stillness of the great hall, the echoes of laughter, plates, and poetry faded into the stones. Until the next time. Unresolved thought. In a world where power was often fleeting and loyalty uncertain, one wonders, did the nobleman truly feed his guests, or feed the myth of his own necessity? A feast remembered. The morning after the feast, the manor is hushed. In the kitchens, servants wash grease from iron pans and sweep bones into buckets. In the hall, wax drips from extinguished tapers, and the scent of wine lingers faintly in the air. Linen cloths are taken down, soaked in barrels and hung to dry. Dogs gnaw scraps beneath the benches. Upstairs, the Lord sleeps. It is the end of something monumental, yet fleeting, a banquet that consumed weeks of preparation, entire animals, barrels of drink, and the strained efforts of dozens, if not hundreds, of people. But while the food is gone, the feast itself is not forgotten. Because a noble feast wasn't just eaten, it was recorded. The feast as chronicle. Many noble households kept household accounts, detailing number and weight of animals slaughtered, quantities of flour, wine, ale, spices, wages paid to temporary staff, items borrowed from neighboring estates, platters, tables, musicians. These records served several purposes: legal and tax documentation, proof of hospitality to a superior lord or visiting official, internal reputation management within the family and retainers. In some cases, special feasts were described in illuminated manuscripts or commemorative poems. Chroniclers might mention particularly grand displays: a roasted ox filled with songbirds, or a pastry castle with edible battlements. To feast was to write oneself into the social memory. And over time, these memories hardened into legend. Feast and famine, the dangerous balance. Yet for all their symbolism and strategic utility, noble feasts carried danger, both financial and physical. A feast could bankrupt an already indebted estate. A poorly timed banquet during a lean year could lead to hunger among household staff or peasants. Noble families, driven by competition or fear of losing face, sometimes hosted elaborate events even as rents faltered and creditors knocked at the gate. Others, desperate to attract political favor or marriage alliances, feasted beyond reason. In one 15th century case, a minor English baron reportedly borrowed against 3 years' harvest to fund a single wedding banquet and never recovered. The line between glory and ruin was thin and gilded with fat. The decline of feasting culture. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, noble feasting began to change. The rise of professional catering in cities lessened the reliance on household staff. The printing press spread books on etiquette and cookery, democratizing food knowledge. Gunpowder warfare and shifting political structures reduced the power of traditional noble households. New foods from exploration, sugar, chocolate, tomatoes transformed diets. The Reformation and changing religious sensibilities questioned the morality of gluttony and waste. Grand feasts did not vanish far from it. Courts like that of Henry VIII or Louis XIV elevated them to new heights. But the rural noble table, with its pie-born pageantry and pig-roast diplomacy, slowly faded. Feasting became more centralized, more theatrical, and in time, more symbolic than substantive. The table as inheritance. Despite their disappearance from daily life, medieval noble feasts left a long and strange legacy. Banquet halls in castles became architectural relics, their high tables still preserved in some estates. Silver cutlery and wine decanters, once used for guests of rank, are now displayed in museums behind glass. Cookbooks such as The Form of Curry and Le Ménagier de Paris survive as historical records, recipes for dishes no longer eaten, but once critical to social life. Modern fine dining, with its emphasis on service, presentation, and ritual, owes much to these feasts. Even holidays today, Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner, wedding banquets echo medieval priorities. Food, order, symbolism, hierarchy. And always the performance. The disappearance of the venison pie. Few modern people have tasted venison pie baked with saffron and raisins, or lamprey in spiced wine. The ingredients still exist. Venison can be hunted, saffron purchased, lampreys caught, but the culture is gone. What's missing is not the recipe, but the world in which such food made sense. A world where game was status, where carving meat was an art of diplomacy, where wine spiced with ginger was not for flavor, but for reverence, where each seat at the table meant something. In that way, the loss of the feast is not about hunger but about order and memory. The quiet of the kitchen. After the last feast, the manor's kitchens may fall silent, pans rust, wine jugs dry, the hearth cools. But somewhere in the walls, the scent of rosemary and pork fat lingers. Somewhere in the soil, bones crushed from yesterday's roast nourish next spring's herbs. And somewhere in the stories told by old retainers to young ones, or penned in half-faded ledgers, the memory of the feast endures. Not as gluttony, but as structure. Final reflection. The noble feast, in all its splendor and strain, reminds us that food is never just food. It is reputation, ritual, negotiation, and memory, all served briefly on a silver plate. But long after the wine is spilled and the tables cleared, we're left with the deeper question. If a man's power was measured in how he feasted, what remains when the table is empty?